Hey there students, welcome back to level 2 for the free Knight D7 Moscow. And for this first game I'll show you a line that is different to what I recommend for our repertoire, because for one thing this game is a very famous historical game and it's a model example of how to play with the knights against the bishops, so it's very useful from that perspective in seeing how Kasparov got beaten by Ivanchuk. At the same time, also can serve as a line that you may consider adding to your own repertoire as well as a possible alternative to my main recommendation, in case you find my main recommendation a little bit too computer-like for some reason. Anyway, the game saw, and this was in Linares 1991, where Ivanchuk as white played e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5, and, well actually I find knight d7 is a move that usually people will play if they play the knight off, because basically you can often aim for a setup that very much resembles a knight off kind of setup with a6 and b5 and bishop b7. So that's kind of the reason behind the popularity of this line. Now, as you may recall from the repertoire overview, my main recommendation as white is the move bishop a4, which I see has actually become quite trendy in 2020, where, for example, Nakamura has been scoring very heavily with this line. They're even scoring wins against players like Nepomniachtchi and Fedoseev and Duda in recent games. Well, we'll talk more about that in the next game. Perhaps it's a good moment just to review a few options that white has, where I remember Carlsen actually has won a couple of nice games with the move a4, but I think that's more due to it being Carlsen playing rather than the objective strength of the line. But it is an interesting alternative as well in case you want a, let's say, very long-term strategic approach. Also moves like c3 and queen e2 are also lines that have a right to exist, where this was a recommendation, I think, of Silicki in his Keep It Simple 1e4 book, although admittedly I think his line was subsequently neutralized by Theory, and nowadays people often play like bishop d3 and try to get an accelerated bishop c2 d4, like even without waiting for black to play a6. I think it's just a way to get a position rather than to fight for an edge, however. And speaking of this bishop d3 plan, actually that is a line that used to be very trendy, to meet a6 with bishop to d3 and kind of switch to playing in a Royal Lepez style fashion against the, against black's setup. But nowadays it's not really as popular, where I think it's because black has subsequently figured out ways to neutralize these ideas. For example, if rook e1 is played, then a good option for black is actually just to play e6, and, well, if white goes c3, then to play like b5, and it was sort of found that this plan of playing c4 and not letting white get d4 was a pretty reliable equalizer from black's perspective, and since then this line kind of died out, and, well, next line scrambled some ideas for white, but even he sort of had to admit that black was probably fine with correct play. And, well, I guess the other move order is to try c3, and, some players try to accelerate the move order by playing bishop c2. But after bishop b7, if white plays queen e2 now, trying to avoid the rook e1 transposition, well, in this case, it's sort of been found that black has a few ways to a reasonable position, where the Indian's preference is either to go for the g6 setup or to play the e6 setup. Basically saying that, well, white has a bit more space, but that black has this good piece pressure, and that basically the position is just equal with correct play. So kind of this castles line is sort of not really trendy, though you never know, maybe someone will come up with some idea to revitalize it. For example, in this position, actually, the move a4 is one that the Indians consider slightly better for white at first, although I don't think there's that much to it personally. But it's a direction you can explore if you're really insistent on playing this way. In any case, the old main line is the move of d4. And I mean, the idea is pretty simple, that if black were to take right away, then white goes queen d4 and says, well, you don't have knight c6 anymore to harass the queen, basically. Admittedly, the reason I decided not to recommend d4 as my main suggestion is because I think after a6, I mean, I studied these lines quite a lot from both white and black's perspective, and I just think these positions are very comfortable for black in general, where, I mean, for example, let's just say if white were to castle, sort of the most obvious move, then black has this move of e5, queen d3, And then the move rook c8 is quite annoying because now like basically c4 coming up with b5 and black gets good counterplay before I can set up the bind. But if white goes knight c3, then black even has moves like h6 or even queen c7 if he wants to stop white getting the knight to d5 easily, where pressure on the c file is a little bit awkward there. So basically this line has kind of been worked out as just being fine for black with the ideas I mentioned of being c4 with b5 and meeting knight c3 like rook c8, queen c7 ideas is just a bit unpleasant for white. So basically, yeah, in the game black played knight f6, which, yeah, it's a little bit committal, but not really a mistake either. So, yeah, white played the move castles at this point. In the old days, it was thought that you had to defend the pawn with knight fc6, but then people sort of realized it wasn't the case, because knight e4 is just kind of giving white too big a lead in development. Actually, I'll kind of see an example of that in the line I recommend in the next game, in fact, to see how white's compensation works there. Well, here black played cd4, queen d4, a6, and yeah, now after bishop d7, this is sort of a better version for white of the lines we saw with d4, cd4, and a6. Because here black is committed to knight to f6. And that means that white can play this move bishop g5, pinning the knight as Ivanchuk did in this game. Subsequent theory found that if black plays e6, then black should be able to equalize with correct play, meaning say knight bd2 with bishop c6. And then the pressure here somewhat discourages knight c4, which kind of doesn't really come to very much for white. But anyway, instead Ivanchuk, or rather Kasparov, played the move h6, which I think was sort of thought to be quite playable until this game was played, and Ivanchuk kind of showed that actually this version of the Rouser structure is just a lot better for white compared to the usual version. And that's because after c4, white just gets a very pleasant bind, and it's very hard for black to get his usual counterplay with b5 on the queen side. Incidentally, knight c3 probably also gives white an advantage, but I think that one good line is sufficient. If e6 the idea is white will probably play... Well, in recent games, white has been preferring moves like knight to d2 and going for the pressure this way, which is quite interesting. But yeah, one good line is enough, and I think that Ivanchuk's play was very convincing in here. So after c4, black played g6, and I won't go super deep into the theory because it's not my main recommendation, but I will mention that maybe bishop g7 and try again f5 probably gave black more counterplay than what he got in the game. So after knight c6, we had rook to c8 played. If black plays bishop e7 in this position, well, it's an interesting question of what plan white should go for here. Where there was an engine game that white won with b4 and just expanding on the queen side, which is very tempting. But I also like the idea of queen d3, which sort of just keeps a good grip over the light squares and can clear the way also for a knight to come to d4 later, perhaps. It seems pretty good for white in any case. Well, after rook c8, Ivanchuk played this move of king h1, which, objectively speaking, is not a particularly precise move, but it was sort of quite effective against Kasparov, because it's sort of a move that says, okay, I can even play a pass move, anticipating rook g8, and still you don't have a useful plan. But objectively speaking, I think that the best plan was either to play a4 and just go b3 and kind of kill their bishop in this way. Or you could play rook ac1 first, which I think is most to the point. And if rook g8, you can go rook fd1 and your rooks are very well placed. And if they try to stop b4, queen a5, again just b3 and white has a very good control over the position. The queen can go to e3 and you can sort of imagine white building up the pressure, getting a pawn to f4 and preparing some pawn break from there to exploit the fact that black's king is after all stuck in the center and therefore the rooks are somewhat discoordinated. The game saw king h1. Black played the move h5. Interestingly enough, bishop g7 and castling might have actually still given black a reasonable position, but h5 I think just sort of is more weakening than helpful. Ivanchuk played the move of a4, which I think maybe he should have prepared with a move like rook fd1 or knight d2. I like rook fd1 just to discourage bishop g7, but anyway, the game saw h4. Ivanchuk fixed the pawn in place with h3. Again, I can't help but feel that this h-pawn advance only created a weakness for white to a target, and now black's king is more or less permanently in the center. Perhaps the best try is queen a5 and try and get some play, but after b3 it's not obvious what the queen really does on a5 in this position. I mean, black isn't in a position to get in b5 because the opening of the center just favors white with black's king in the middle. Well, after bishop e7, white played b4, which stops the move queen a5. Although it's probably a bit imprecise. Actually, queen d3 and b3 is probably the correct way to keep control. Because now after b4, actually, Kasparov had an unlikely way to, in fact, disrupt the play a bit. Where rather than his a5 move, he actually could have played queen c7. And then met knight d2 with d5, just sort of blowing open the center for the bishop pair. And this would have given quite interesting compensation after ed5 and queen e5. Where, after takes, white does keep an extra pawn by playing rook ab1. But I think that after f5, black's bishop pair and his active pawns do give him reasonable compensation. Maybe not equalizing compensation, but I think enough to have some counterplay at least. So this is probably was black's last chance really to, sort of disrupt white's control over the position. It's one thing you might notice in these that, basically the bishop b5 Moscow is a very controlling line, where we sort of just kind of build up this very stable positional foundation and just squelch all of black's standard counterplay. So after a5, Ivanchuk played b5, sort of realizing that after queen c7 and knight d2 that actually the c5 outpost doesn't do that much for black when he doesn't have a knight to put on this square. So after queen c5, obviously black's king is a lot more exposed, therefore white kept the queens on with queen d3. And after rook g8 and rook a1, well, we can say white is just clearly better, where already the computer wants to do something radical like f5 and sacrifice a pawn to get some activity, but it already smacks of desperation. So after queen g5, white played rook g1, killing all the counterplay down the g file, and black played queen to f4. Like, maybe trying to rerun the king to king side may have been a better try, but in any case, I'm not really a fan of black's position. White played rook ef1, which, it's a safe enough move, although I think knight f3 and trying to win the pawn this way may have been a bit more pointed. In any case, rook ef1 was played, and I mean, I think black has to go f5. Like, if he doesn't play it soon, he's just never going to get the chance, and, well, the game shows how black basically gets squashed if he doesn't try to disrupt the play in some form. Because if you don't open the position, the bishops are just kind of useless here. Well, the game saw b6, and that was just a mistake after knight e2 and queen h6. I mean, the normal move is just to play f4 and leave the queen completely out of play and prepare f5 to pressure the e6 pawn from there. But Ivanchuk side go to plan Ivanchuk, and he played the move c5, sacrificing a pawn to clear c4 for the knight, and objectively, it's not as strong as f4, but it worked out very well in the game because Kasparov didn't find the best defense here. If you want to challenge yourself, you can try to find a better defense. So it turns out that dc5 was the best move to keep the structure solid. I mean, after rook b8, if white plays rook to d1, it turns out after bishop c8, there's actually no mate in that case. Where in fact, maybe white should play f4 first, and that probably gives a bit more sting to the attack. But anyway, it seems that black is holding for the moment here, even though his position is still not very appealing. But instead, Kasparov played rook c5, and then after knight c4, the whole d6 pawn completely collapses. And also b6 can't really be defended anymore either. So the game concluded with the moves king f8, knight b6, bishop e8. The most efficient, I think, was rook c1 and just invading down the c file, but Ivanchuk first played f4, which it turns out is also winning. After f5, white exchanged, using a fact that ef5 is giving a big square for the knight, but rook f5 allows rook c1, and still the rooks invade this way. And after king g7, Ivanchuk just kept on attacking with the move g4. Although it turns out technically knight c8 was a bit more clinical, just forking the bishop and rook pawn to basically win material that way. After g4, black tried rook c5. Obviously, he can't afford to open up the g file for white's rook and queen. And after takes, I mean, knight c8 was sort of a very creative move, just dominating the bishop on the edge of the board. And after bishop f8 and queen d8, it's clear that there's nowhere for black's pieces to go, that they're all completely dominated here. In the game after queen g6, white played the move f5 first, just stopping any queen e4 counterplay. And after queen h6, well, black's final trap is at queen e8. Will be a mistake because of the queen e3 counterattack. but g5 first just completely stops it. After queen h5 and rook g4, finally black's position collapses. And after ef5, knight f4, very strong intermediate move. And queen h8, then yeah, after queen f6, king h7 and rook h4, it's checkmate next move, and Kasparov resigned here. That's a very inspiring game that shows if your opponent is not prepared for these bishop b5 Moscow lines, then the d4 approach can be quite unpleasant, as you get a nice lead in development, and in many cases if black doesn't get a quick e5, b5 in reply to c4, then that Maroczy bind may just give you a quite pleasant edge, practically speaking. But yeah, objectively, black has sort of figured out the ways to equalize in these lines, and that is why, although this game is a very beautiful one, in the next game I will cover bishop a4, which is my main recommendation. And if pressed, I would say the strongest move for white at this point, even on an objective level as well as a practical one. Where I actually see that statistically white is scoring 53.6% with bishop a4, which might not seem all that impressive, but I think it's so partly because of some, let's say, relatively low-rated players kind of playing without really knowing what they were doing, and sort of decreasing the score a little bit. Because in recent games, white is scoring really well and winning, quite a lot of our games from this position. Anyway, I'll talk more about bishop a4 in the next game, so I will see you there.